July 9th, 1946. Thunder erupts over East Wheel Rose as nearly 6 inches of rain falls in less than half an hour. Down in the mine, water crashes through the tunnels, rising relentlessly, while above ground, the 30-ton Cornish beam engine groans and hammers at full speed, desperately trying to hold back the flood. For the 100 men below, there is no margin for error, as the pumps strain against an impossible torrent. The difference between survival and mass drowning balances on steel, steam, and minute-to-minute vigilance. On this day, the engine cannot keep up. In the space of minutes, 39 miners are doomed, drowning as water outruns the machine designed to save them. What made these engines both the lifeline and the lethal risk for every miner in Cornwall? The answer begins in those last frantic seconds, when the engine's power determines who lives and who is lost forever. At 13:05, the first surge of floodwater reached the surface of the Innis shaft at East Wheel Rose. Rain hammered down, 5, maybe 6 inches in just half an hour, turning the mine's bowl-shaped hollow into a cauldron. Water began to pour into the main shaft, unchecked and relentless, as men underground felt the first signs of disaster. A sudden gust, the air pressure from the torrent above, snuffed out every candle in the shaft. In an instant, the tunnels vanished into darkness. Panic spread fast. Miners, some still clutching tools, abandoned their posts and scrambled for the ladders or the nearest kibble, the iron bucket used for hauling men and ore. Above, the engine house roared to life. The Cornish beam engine, 30 tons of cast iron, its great beam pivoting overhead, thundered at full stroke. Thomas Price, the engine keeper on duty, received the alarm at 13:12. He and fireman John Harris had drilled for emergencies, but nothing matched the chaos of a real flood. Harris shoveled coal into the boiler, fighting to keep the pressure at a steady 32 pounds per square inch, even as cold spray and wind battered the furnace. Price watched the dials, felt the vibration through the beam, and braced for the worst. At 13:15, the first rescue lift began. 18 men, drenched and shaken, clung to the chain kibble as the beam engine hauled them up from the darkness. The ground crew pulled them clear just as another rush of water echoed up the shaft. For a moment, the engine's power made escape possible, steel and steam working in perfect, desperate rhythm with human hands. But below, the water kept rising. The engine men knew the margin for error was razor thin. Every second counted. The engine's pulse became the only hope for those still trapped, its massive beam swinging in a rhythm that meant either deliverance or doom. In those frantic minutes, the relationship between man and machine was absolute. The engine was more than iron and steam. It was the last line between survival and tragedy, and every decision, every movement, mattered. The teamwork of Price and Harris, forged in routine and tested by crisis, held the line for as long as the laws of physics allowed. But the flood was relentless, and the next test would come before the last echoes of the first rescue had faded. Water poured in faster than anyone could measure. The Cornish beam engine, once the pride of the mine, was outmatched. Rain hammered the ground, and by the time the first rescue bucket surfaced, the inflow had already surged past 1,200 gallons per minute, soon pushing toward 1,500. The engine's best output, 12,000 gallons an hour, simply couldn't keep up. Underground, the roar of water chased men through the dark. Some pressed against timbers. Others clung to the last dry rungs, hoping for a way out that never came. At 1:20 p.m., the brattices, wooden barriers meant to channel air and water, collapsed. Water crashed through, flooding the pump chamber and threatening the engine's core. The 55-ton beam slowed, the boiler lost steam, and fireman John Harris fought to keep the flames alive. But the beam stalled, hanging silent in the gloom. In that silence, Samuel Bastian moved. He grabbed a plank, crawled into the rising water, and wedged it across a manhole. For a few minutes, the makeshift plug held, buying time as water was forced away from the lowest levels. Bastian's hands bled from the effort, but his gamble worked briefly. Above, the engine men coaxed the boiler back to life, but the beam could only manage 8,000 gallons an hour, maybe less. The fight was slipping away. By 2 p.m., water reached the top of Michelle's shaft. The pump chamber was half flooded, the engine straining. In the lower levels, hope faded. Ladders were slick, the air thick with steam and fear. When the count was done, 39 men and boys had drowned. Their names filled the coroner's ledger, their families left to grieve. The window for escape had closed, not with a crash, but with the slow halt of a machine pushed past its limits. The laws of physics, and choices made long before, had the final word. A Cornish beam engine was built on a scale that bordered on the unbelievable. Its heart was a cylinder, cast in iron, with a bore measuring 67 inches across. Steam rushed in, driving a piston on a 12-foot stroke, each movement lifting a weight that matched a small locomotive. Above, the beam itself, a single iron mass weighing 55 tons, rocked on its pivot, slow but unstoppable. With every swing, energy traveled down a line of wrought iron rods, plunging deep into the earth. These rods powered a force pump, built to move water from the mine's lowest reaches to the surface. Each stroke displaced 250 gallons, enough to fill over 1,000 buckets in an hour if the engine ran without rest. The valve system was the engine's nerve center, controlling the flow of high-pressure steam into the cylinder. Timing was everything. If a valve stuck or a rod slipped, the beam's rhythm would falter, and the chain of pumps could stall. The boiler, watched by the firemen, had to hold steady at 32 pounds per square inch, sometimes more in emergencies, risking damage to keep the mine dry. The mass of the beam stabilized the stroke, making each lift smooth and powerful, but it also carried risk. Any sudden stop could snap a rod or crack iron. Engine men lived with this tension, always listening for a change in the beam's rhythm, a hiss of escaping steam, a tremor in the pump rod, signs that something was amiss. When the engine ran well, it could empty 12,000 gallons from a 300-foot shaft in an hour, holding back the underground river that threatened the mine. For those who worked beneath the beam, the machine's scale was inescapable. The heat, the noise, the relentless motion, these were the realities of life in the engine house. The beam engine was the mine's heartbeat, steady, immense, indispensable. A Cornish beam engine could never afford a moment's rest. Down in the heart of the mine, water pressed from every fissure and seam, a silent enemy that never slept. The only thing holding it back was the unrelenting up and down motion of the pump rods, plunging 300 feet into the earth. Every stroke mattered. If the engine hesitated, even for a single beat, the balance shifted. Underground, the pressure of the rock and the weight of the water formed a chain, one that pulled upward with every movement of the beam and threatened to snap the instant the rhythm broke. The numbers were unforgiving. At East Wheel Rose, the main shaft reached 300 feet, and the pump rod stretched the entire distance. Each time the engine's piston completed its stroke, it lifted hundreds of gallons from the flooded depths. But the margin was razor thin. A single missed stroke, just one, could let the water rise by 4 inches in the shaft. 4 inches might sound trivial, but in a mine, it was the difference between a clear ladder and a submerged rung. In heavy ground, a pause of just 5 minutes could mean the water climbed a foot or more, swallowing escape routes and cutting men off from the surface. The chain reaction was absolute. If the engine stopped, the pump rods hung useless in the shaft, and water surged upward, pressing into the workings where men still clung to hope. The deeper the mine, the greater the threat. At 300 feet, the pressure from above was enough to force water through cracks no wider than a finger. The beam engine's entire purpose was to hold that pressure at bay, stroke after stroke, hour after hour. Even the most skilled engine keeper, the most vigilant fireman, could not afford a moment's distraction. The machine demanded constant attention, a steady hand on the valve, a sharp ear for the hiss of escaping steam, eyes always on the dials. This was not just a matter of efficiency or pride. It was survival. The men who worked the pumps knew that if the engine faltered, the water would not wait. There was no grace period, no second chance. The relationship between the engine and the mine was a contest of endurance, with lives depending on the outcome. In the end, the laws of physics allowed no forgiveness. When the beam swung, men lived. When it paused, the mine began to drown. At St. Aubyn's shaft, ambition took physical form in the largest beam engine the world had ever seen. The numbers alone defy easy comprehension. A cylinder bored to 160 inches across, over 13 feet in diameter, anchored in stone and iron. Each stroke of the piston displaced a volume of water so vast it could fill a small pond in minutes. The beam itself, a giant of cast iron, weighed more than a herd of oxen and swept through its arc with the measured certainty of a metronome. Every upstroke and downstroke lifted nearly 2 tons of water from the deepest galleries, a feat repeated again and again, hour after hour, without rest. At its peak, this engine could move 30,000 gallons per hour, a flow that dwarfed the output of any rival in Britain or beyond. Inside the engine house, the atmosphere was thick with heat and the smell of oil and steam. The walls trembled with each movement of the beam, and the floor vibrated beneath the feet of the men who tended the valves and stoked the fires. To witness the engine at work was to feel the raw scale of human ambition, iron and steam harnessed to a single purpose, holding back the ancient, patient pressure of the Earth's water. Yet for all its size and power, the engine's supremacy was never absolute. Every part, from the massive piston to the smallest valve rod, had to perform in perfect concert. A single seized bearing or a missed beat in the firing routine could bring the entire system to a halt, turning strength into sudden vulnerability. The engine at St. Albans was not just a marvel of engineering, it was a monument to the thin line between mastery and disaster. Its presence inspired awe, but lurking beneath the surface was a reminder. Even the greatest machines could be humbled in an instant. The promise of safety and prosperity rested on a foundation that, for all its weight, could prove fragile when nature pressed too hard. In 1869, United Mines faced disaster as relentless rain soaked the moors above St. Just. Water pressed against the shaft collar, a timber and earth barrier meant to hold back the flood. When the collar gave way, muddy water surged down the main shaft. The mine's single 80-inch Cornish beam engine strained to keep up, its pump rods pounding as water rose. But the inflow was too much. Within an hour, the lower levels were submerged. 27 men, working deep underground, found their escape routes cut off. The engine fought on until steam ran out, then fell silent. That week, 27 names were added to the parish records, each a stark reminder of what happens when a single machine stands between life and death. 14 years later, Wheel Bassett in Camborne echoed the same story, but with a different failure. Here, the threat came from within. The boiler that powered the pump, weakened by years of repairs and neglect. When a sudden flood hit, the firemen struggled to keep pressure up, but the boiler faltered. The 90-inch beam engine slowed, then stopped. Water rushed in, trapping 22 men below. The official report pointed to poor boiler maintenance and the lack of a backup system. Again, lives depended on a single point of failure. These were not isolated events. 27 lost at United Mines, 22 at Wheel Bassett. Each case exposed a system built on hope and habit. The lesson was written in the records. One failure and the margin for error vanished. Before disaster ever threatened, the engine house ran on ritual. At 6 each morning, Thomas Price, the engine keeper, walked the floor, checking the iron cylinder for leaks, feeling for stiffness along the piston rod, and testing the valve gear by hand. John Harris, the fireman, was already at the boiler, shoveling coal, eyes fixed on the water glass for any sign of trouble. The Bradisher arrived soon after, inspecting the wooden partitions that kept air flowing and water away from the pump rods. 12-hour shifts set the rhythm, 12 on, 12 off, each man following a routine that left nothing to chance. The battered logbook on its shelf held every detail: boiler pressure, temperature, odd vibrations, stray hisses of steam. Hourly, Harris reported pressure to Price. The Bradisher replaced any warped or split Bradis, knowing a single loose board could spell disaster. Communication was spare and exact. Bell codes: 1 ring for attention, 2 for danger, 3 for rising water. Cut through stone and steam. Every week, the crew drilled for emergencies, hauling a weighted dummy from the shaft to test their speed and coordination. Engine men learned to read the machine's mood by touch and sound. One recalled, years later, how he could feel the pulse of the engine in his fingertips, a living rhythm that warned of danger before any gauge moved. Their discipline, trust, and respect for the engine formed an invisible barrier against chaos, holding the mine safe until new technology could offer backup. Redundancy in Cornish mining was born from necessity, not excess. For years, a single beam engine stood between miners and disaster, its failure measured in funerals, its reliability in anxious hours. The turning point came in 1876, when Dalcoath installed a turbine-driven centrifugal pump. Capable of moving 20,000 gallons per hour, it nearly doubled the output of the largest beam engines and needed only a valve to start, no matter the hour or weather. By 1885, Wheel Grace introduced the first electric mine pump, a 5 kilowatt backup that could spring to life within minutes if the main engine failed. In 1892, East Wheel Rose rebuilt its engine house with a dual system, a 150-inch compound turbine, paired with an electric secondary, creating the first true underground safety net. Now, if one machine faltered, another was ready. The system itself became the safeguard, not just the men who watched over it. Change wasn't only mechanical. The Shaft Collar Protection Act of 1848 and the Pump Capacity Inspection of 1850 forced every shaft to be ringed by an earthen bund and every pump's capacity checked against the worst flood on record. These laws demanded managers plan for failure, not just hope against it. Samuel Bastian's desperate plank in the floodwater became a spark for a new philosophy: never trust a single point of failure. Redundancy, once seen as waste, became the new standard of safety. When lives depend on inches of water and moments of warning, only systems built for the day something fails can truly protect. Even now, our lives depend on single, unseen systems, grids, pumps, algorithms, each as critical as the engines that once held back the dark in Cornwall. When vigilance slips, consequences remain absolute. The lesson endures. Trust in a lone safeguard breeds both comfort and risk, and every system's breaking point is just one overlooked moment away. If these stories matter to you, consider subscribing for more history that's still shaping us.